we're diving into something today that sounds like straight out of a Cold War thriller, right?
Yeah.
Russia's dead hand. And this system is so unsettling. Some folks even call it a doomsday device.
Right.
You sent over some sources about dead hand, and it looks like there's been some pretty recent developments, huh?
Yeah, definitely dead hand. Essentially, you can think of it as like an automated system, right?
Yeah.
Designed to launch Russia's nuclear weapons if a nuclear attack on the country is detected.
Oh, wow.
And what makes it really chilling is that it can supposedly launch these things even if Russia's leaders are gone.
Wow.
Wiped out.
So even if there's no one to give the order.
Exactly. And recently, there's been a lot of stir because Putin has actually made statements,
Yeah.
that dead hand is not only still active,
Wow.
but it's possibly being upgraded.
Wow. That's definitely unsettling, to say the least. Especially with everything going on in the world right now. And I have to admit, I found the information on dead hand a little kind of overwhelming and confusing.
Right.
There's just so much information out there. It's really hard to tell what's real and what's just, speculation.
Yeah.
So, but that's where this deep dive comes in. We're going to use the sources that you sent to, try and understand exactly what this system is and why it matters.
Yeah, that's precisely what we're aiming for. And I think to get a clearer picture, we really have to look back at the historical context.
Right.
What led to this dead hand in the first place. So we need to go back to the Cold War, a time, where there was just intense paranoia and this existential fear, right, between these superpowers.
Yeah.
And so back then, the main doctrine, the prevailing thought was mutually assured destruction, right?
Right.
So MAD, they call it MAD. The idea was that if one side launched a nuclear attack, well, the other side would retaliate.
Right.
Right, of course.
And, both nations would be destroyed.
Right, makes sense.
But the Soviets were very particularly worried about a specific scenario, and that was a decapitation strike.
Okay, so basically they were afraid of being caught totally off guard
Yes.
and not being able to hit back.
Exactly, precisely.
Oh, wow.
They feared that the U.S. might, try to take out their leadership in a surprise attack and prevent them from launching a counterstrike.
Oh, wow.
So dead hand really emerges as their solution.
I see.
To guarantee retaliation, no matter what, no matter the circumstances.
Wow. Okay, so let's dig into how dead hand is supposed to work.
For sure.
What can we piece together from these sources we got?
So picture this, right? A heavily fortified bunker, most likely, somewhere south of Moscow.
Okay.
It houses this, central hub, this brain of dead hand.
Okay.
And it's constantly monitoring all these sensors.
Right. That are spread out across Russia. And these sensors, right, they're designed to detect signs of a nuclear attack.
So what kind of signs are we talking about?
So many different things, like seismic activity, to pick up the explosions, light sensors, right, to detect those bright flashes, radiation detectors, even sensors that can, register changes in air pressure.
It's like an incredibly complex, tripwire.
Right.
Just waiting to be, tripped.
A good analogy. That's a good analogy. And now it's crucial to understand that, this wouldn't be activated by just any small incident or a false alarm. We're talking massive coordinated nuclear attack on Russia.
Okay, got it.
If those sensors detect that kind of attack, then the system springs into action automatically.
Wow.
It doesn't require a human to push the button or a general to give an order.
Wow.
Designed to be entirely self-sufficient.
So if that were to happen, would it just launch all of Russia's nukes immediately?
Well, actually, no, it's a bit more intricate than that. What makes dead hand particularly unsettling is that it doesn't directly launch the main nuclear arsenal.
Okay.
Instead, it triggers the launch of a special command missile.
A command missile? What is that? What does it do?
You can think of it almost like a flying signal booster.
Okay.
So this missile, it's launched high above Russia, and it transmits these coded signals that activate these pre-programmed launch sequences for any remaining weapons.
Oh, wow.
So that means it could potentially activate ICBMs in their silos.
Okay.
And there's even speculation that it could trigger mobile launchers, on trucks and things.
Wait, hold on. So even if, say, Moscow was completely destroyed, this command missile could still set off launches from all over Russia.
Yeah.
Targeting wherever their, pre-programmed to go.
Yes, that's the terrifying logic here, right? It ensures retaliation even in those most extreme situations. And it's worth noting, there's an anecdote in one of the sources about the crew that's responsible for operating this dead hand system.
Is that the one where they're described as essentially having no decision-making authority?
Exactly. Their role is really limited to making sure the system is functional, like they don't analyze data, they don't make any judgments, they just make sure the system is ready. One source even compared them to, Pavlovian dogs.
That's a pretty chilling image.
Yeah.
But wouldn't having this entire system be automated actually make it riskier?
Okay.
What if there's a technical malfunction or false alarm?
Right. And that's where we encounter this paradox, right?
Yeah.
With Dead Hand.
Okay.
It embodies both terror and potential stability.
Right.
On the one hand, the idea of a machine making the decision to launch a nuclear attack, that's deeply disturbing. But on the other hand, it removes the risk of human error.
Right.
A leader making a rash decision under pressure.
So, in a way, it's like the Soviets were taking this calculated gamble.
You could say that. They were betting that the sheer threat of Dead Hand would be enough to deter any adversary from even considering a first strike.
Right, because why risk total annihilation if you're going to be hit back with the same force?
Exactly.
Even if you take out their leadership.
It's
all about deterrence. But how can we even be sure this system is still even in operation?
Well, as recently as 2011, Russia's Missile Forces commander, he publicly confirmed Dead Hand was operational.
Oh, wow.
Of course, we don't know the extent to which it's been upgraded or its exact capabilities today. That's classified information.
And how many nuclear weapons are we talking here? How many nukes could this thing launch?
Yeah. Well, the precise number, of course, that's a closely guarded secret. But some experts estimate that Dead Hand could control upwards of 30 nuclear warheads.
30 warheads. That's enough to
cause unimaginable devastation.
Right. So this isn't some abstract threat. This is a real system.
Right.
With real weapons ready to go, automatically.
That's the chilling reality, and it raises some really, complex questions about nuclear deterrence, the role of technology in warfare. I mean, the future of humanity itself.
And speaking of technology, one of the sources I came across expressed concern about cyber attacks.
Right.
Given that this system is so heavily automated, couldn't it be vulnerable to hacking?
Right.
Could someone trigger Dead Hand remotely? That's
a very valid concern, especially in today's world, right?
Right.
The more intricate and interconnected a system is, the more susceptible it becomes to these kinds of cyber attacks.
Right.
Whether a sophisticated hacking group or even a nation-state actor, could they infiltrate Dead Hand's defenses?
Yeah.
And potentially send false signals to trigger a launch? Yeah. That's a question that we can't definitively rule out. It's a disturbing thought, to say the least.
It certainly is. And then there's the whole situation with, Ukraine.
Right.
Russia has been making a lot of nuclear threats ever since that invasion began.
Yes, absolutely. And this brings us to another really crucial point. Russia's updated nuclear doctrine. The sources you provided, they suggest that Russia has lowered the threshold for using nuclear weapons.
Lowered the threshold? What does that even mean?
Well, so their previous doctrine from 2020 that stated that nuclear weapons would only be used in response to a nuclear attack or a conventional attack that threatened, the very survival of the state.
Okay.
But this new doctrine appears to be much broader.
How so? What do you mean?
Well, Putin himself has actually stated that any conventional attack on Russia that receives support from a nuclear power.
Right.
And he's clearly alluding to the support Ukraine is getting from NATO.
Right.
He said that would be considered a joint attack.
So even a conventional attack could trigger a nuclear response from Russia?
Yes, potentially. And it goes even further than that.
Okay.
The new doctrine suggests that even a conventional attack without direct involvement from a nuclear power could justify a nuclear response if Russia perceives it as an existential threat to its sovereignty.
That seems like a pretty low bar for using nukes. Who decides what is an existential threat?
That's precisely the issue, right?
Yeah,
It's a subjective and dangerous criterion, and it directly relates back to the situation in Ukraine. Russia has consistently accused the U.S. of enabling attacks on Russian territory.
like the recent Ukrainian strike on the Bryansk region, using those U.S.-supplied ATACMS missiles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That incident, along with Ukraine's counteroffensive and their requests for, longer-range weapons that could strike deeper into Russia,
Right.
all of that has undoubtedly, escalated tensions and fueled this shift in Russia's nuclear doctrine.
So how does this all connect back to dead hand? Surely even Putin wouldn't risk global annihilation over just a conventional attack.
That's the question that keeps a lot of experts up at night.
Right.
The exact triggers for dead hand are still classified, but with this new, more expansive doctrine, it is at least conceivable that even a conventional attack, if perceived as an existential threat by Russia, could be interpreted as justification for activating the system.
But if dead hand is specifically designed to respond to a nuclear attack, how could a conventional attack possibly trigger it?
It's unlikely that a conventional attack, like on its own, would directly activate dead hand. However, such an attack, if it inflicts significant damage or is seen as a precursor to a larger offensive, that could lead to a heightened state of alert within Russia's military, right?
Right.
This heightened alert combined with this lower threshold for nuclear weapon use could create a situation where dead hand is brought online just as a precautionary measure.
So we have a system primed for immediate action. We have a lowered threshold for using nuclear weapons, and we have a conflict that seems to be, constantly escalating. It's not exactly like a comforting situation.
It's a deeply concerning situation, to say the least.
Yeah.
It really underscores the inherent dangers of relying on nuclear deterrence, especially in a world where, miscalculations, misunderstandings can have these catastrophic consequences.
It's easy to get lost in the technical side of dead hand.
Right.
All the talk about sensors and missiles and automated sequences. But I think what really strikes me is what this system truly symbolizes.
I agree. It's a chilling manifestation of Cold War thinking. It's a logic that essentially says, if I'm going down, you're coming down with me.
Yeah. It's that whole mutually assured destruction concept.
Exactly.
But taken to a whole other level.
Oh, an extreme level. And what's particularly unsettling is that this kind of thinking, this reliance on nuclear deterrence, hasn't disappeared, with the end of the Cold War. It seems to be experiencing a resurgence, especially now with all these, geopolitical tensions.
Yeah. Feels like we're sleepwalking back into a nuclear nightmare. But earlier you said that dead hand could also be seen as a force for stability.
Right.
Can you kind of expand on that a little?
Sure. Consider, this perspective. If both sides know that any nuclear attack will inevitably result in their own destruction, regardless of who strikes first, then theoretically neither side has any incentive to launch that initial attack. So it creates a sort of a terrifying deadlock.
It's like a high-stakes game of chicken.
Yeah.
But with the most devastating consequences you can imagine.
That's a very apt comparison, and the hope is that the fear of those consequences, that knowledge that there can be no victors in a nuclear war, will be enough to prevent the game from ever being played.
Yeah.
Right.
But what about the possibility of accidents or malfunctions?
Yeah.
Or human error?
Those are inherent risks in any complex system, especially one like this. The sources that you shared, they raise some very real concerns about this. As we discussed, the potential for cyber attacks, right? Then there's the possibility of technical failures, data misinterpretations, and even simple human mistakes. We have to remember the crew operating dead hand, although they're highly trained, they're still human.
Right. So any one of those factors could potentially trigger a launch.
Yeah. It's a disturbing thought, but yes, it's a possibility. And it becomes even more complicated when we factor in, the psychological element. Imagine the pressure on those crew members, knowing that the fate of the world could hinge on their actions or inactions.
That's incredible amount of responsibility to bear.
Absolutely. And then there's the issue of escalation, right? Let's say we have a conventional conflict, something, similar to the situation in Ukraine, but on a larger scale. Tensions are high. Both sides are on edge.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden there's a false alarm, right?
Okay.
Maybe a radar glitch.
Right.
Or a misidentified satellite.
Yeah.
In a highly tense environment, that false alarm could trigger a chain reaction that just spirals out of control.
So even if dead hand itself doesn't malfunction,
Right.
its existence could contribute to, a scenario where nukes are used?
Precisely. That's why even if you believe in the logic of nuclear deterrence, even if you think dead hand is a necessary evil, you have to acknowledge the inherent risks
Right.
and the potential for unintended consequences.
Okay, so we've delved into the history, the mechanics, the risks. What does all this mean for, us?
Right.
For the world today?
Right.
Does dead hand actually make us safer?
That's the million-dollar question, and there's no simple answer.
Yeah.
On the one hand, the fact that Russia possesses the system and their willingness to use it, well, that serves as a deterrent.
Okay.
It forces other nuclear powers to really, really carefully consider the consequences of any actions that could be perceived as a threat to Russia's existence.
But what about the other side of the coin?
Right.
What are the downsides?
Well, on the other hand, the very existence of dead hand, well, it increases the overall risk of nuclear war, right?
Yeah.
It introduces this possibility of accidental launch,
Yeah.
miscalculation, escalation.
Right.
It creates this atmosphere of fear, distrust. That makes it much, much more difficult to find peaceful resolutions to international conflicts.
So are we trapped in this paradoxical situation where the very thing that's meant to keep us safe
Yeah.
is also the thing that puts us in the most danger?
That's the dilemma of nuclear deterrence,
Yeah.
in a nutshell. And it's not just a problem for Russia.
Right.
It's a problem for all nuclear powers. The U.S., China, France, the U.K., they all have their own versions of dead hand. Systems designed to guarantee retaliation even in the most extreme scenarios.
So what can we do?
Right.
Is there a way out of this? Like madness?
Well, that's a complex issue that could be its own deep dive, but I think it boils down to diplomacy.
Okay.
Arms control and building trust. We need to find ways to reduce these nuclear arsenals,
Yeah.
strengthen international agreements, and create a world where countries don't feel the need to rely on, the threat of annihilation to protect their interests.
That sounds incredibly challenging.
It certainly is, but it's the only way to truly escape the shadow of dead hand and ensure that these horrifying weapons are never used.
So where do we go from here?
Yeah.
It's easy to just feel overwhelmed by all of this.
It is a lot to process. But I think the most important thing is to stay informed, to grasp, the complexities of this issue and to engage in constructive dialogue.
Yeah. Yeah.
We need to move beyond these simplistic, narratives of good versus evil, us versus them.
Right.
Nuclear war is a threat to all of humanity.
Yeah.
And preventing it will require a collective effort.
Right. All right. That's a sobering thought. We've covered a lot of ground here.
We have. But I believe that knowledge is empowering, right?
Yeah.
The more we understand these threats, the better equipped we are to confront them, to work towards a future where this specter of nuclear annihilation no longer hangs over humanity.
I completely agree. We can't let fear of dead hand paralyze us,
Yeah.
We have to use that fear as motivation,
Right.
as a driving force to create a more peaceful and a secure world for ourselves and for future generations.
Absolutely. When we delve into these topics like dead hand, I think it's natural to feel a sense of unease, right?
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder of how precarious our existence can be.
It's definitely heavy stuff, but I think it's also incredibly important to understand these issues. Earlier we were talking about Russia's updated nuclear doctrine, right?
Right.
What are the potential ramifications of that shift, especially with what's going on in Ukraine?
It's a dangerous development, no doubt. By lowering the threshold for using nuclear weapons, Russia is essentially, expanding the range of scenarios where they might consider a nuclear response.
Okay.
This introduces a greater element of unpredictability, and it raises concerns about miscalculation or escalation. The fact that they now view any conventional attack supported by a nuclear power as a justification for a nuclear response, that's particularly alarming.
It seems like that could create like a slippery slope.
Precisely. And it's worth noting that this updated doctrine doesn't just pertain to attacks involving NATO countries.
Okay.
It also suggests that even a conventional attack without direct involvement from a nuclear power could potentially trigger a nuclear response.
Wow.
If Russia perceives it as an existential threat to its sovereignty.
That's a very broad definition. Like who decides what an existential threat is?
Exactly. That's the danger of such vague language. It introduces this level of subjectivity that could be easily exploited,
Right.
especially in a tense geopolitical environment.
Could you give us like a concrete example of how this new doctrine might play out in like a real world scenario?
Sure. Let's say there's a significant conventional attack on Russian territory, perhaps a large-scale military offensive. Even if this attack doesn't involve the use of nuclear weapons or direct support from a NATO country,
Right.
Russia could potentially interpret it as an existential threat and justify a nuclear response based on their updated doctrine.
And in that kind of scenario, is it possible that dead hand could come into play?
It's difficult to say for certain because the exact triggers for activating dead hand, those remain classified.
Right.
However, it's plausible that in a situation of, heightened tension and perceived existential threat,
Right.
Russia might choose to bring dead hand online as a precautionary measure.
Wow.
Remember, the system is designed to ensure retaliation, even in the most extreme circumstances.
That's a terrifying thought.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier that even those who, support the idea of nuclear deterrence as like a necessary evil, they should acknowledge the risks.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that?
Of course. The logic behind nuclear deterrence rests on the assumption that the fear of mutually assured destruction will prevent any rational actor from initiating a nuclear attack.
Right.
However, this logic relies on several key assumptions. That all actors involved will always behave rationally, that there will never be miscalculations or misinterpretations of intentions, and that technology will function flawlessly.
And those are some pretty big assumptions.
Absolutely. Human history is filled with examples of irrational behavior, miscalculations, and unforeseen technological failures. To base our security on the assumption that these things will never happen in the context of nuclear weapons is, to put it mildly, a risky proposition.
So even if dead hand is never intentionally activated,
Right.
even if it serves its purpose as a deterrent,
Right.
its very existence still introduces a significant amount of risk.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that the risks associated with dead hand aren't limited to just the possibility of an accidental launch. The system itself and the doctrine behind it contribute to this atmosphere of fear and distrust
Right.
that makes it more difficult to find peaceful resolutions to international conflicts.
So it seems like we're caught in this vicious cycle where the more we rely on these weapons for our security, the less secure we actually become.
That's a key insight. We need to find alternative ways to ensure global security, ways that don't rely on this constant threat of nuclear annihilation.
Right.
This is where the concepts of diplomacy and arms control become crucial.
Let's talk more about that. What specific steps can be taken to mitigate the risks posed by systems like dead hand and reduce the threat of nuclear war?
Well, one of the most important steps is to revitalize existing arms control treaties and work towards new agreements that address the evolving nature of the nuclear threat.
Okay.
New START Treaty, for instance, which limits the number of strategic nuclear warheads deployed by the U.S. and Russia,
Right.
that's set to expire in 2026.
What happens if that treaty isn't renewed?
It would be a major setback for global security. We could see a new arms race, potentially leading to a significant increase in the number of nuclear weapons worldwide.
So renewing New START would be a good starting point.
Absolutely.
What else can be done?
Another crucial area to address is the issue of tactical nuclear weapons.
Okay.
These are smaller, shorter-range nuclear weapons, designed for use on the battlefield,
Okay.
as opposed to the massive, city-destroying strategic nuclear weapons.
Why are tactical nuclear weapons a particular concern? I'm not sure I understand the distinction.
Well, tactical nuclear weapons are often considered more usable than strategic weapons because they're smaller size and shorter range.
Okay.
It might create the perception that they can be used in a more limited way. with less catastrophic consequences. However, this is a dangerous illusion.
Okay.
Any use of nuclear weapons, regardless of their size or intended target, has the potential to escalate rapidly and lead to a full-blown nuclear exchange.
So limiting or ideally eliminating tactical nuclear weapons entirely should be a priority.
Absolutely. And this requires, open dialogue, negotiation, and a genuine willingness on the part of all nuclear powers to find common ground,
Right.
to compromise. It's a challenging task, but it's essential for the long-term security of humanity.
Yeah, that'll make sense. But given the current state of global affairs, with tension so high between these major powers,
Yeah.
is this kind of cooperation even realistic?
It might seem like a long shot, especially given the current geopolitical climate.
Right.
But we can't afford to give in to cynicism or despair.
Right.
The stakes are simply too high.
Yeah.
We have to keep pushing for diplomacy, dialogue, and cooperation.
You're right. It's easy to feel overwhelmed,
Yeah.
by the scale and complexity of these issues. But we can't allow ourselves to just become paralyzed by fear or apathy.
I completely agree. It's important to remember that we as individuals, we have a role to play in preventing nuclear war.
Okay.
We can educate ourselves about these issues, we can engage with our elected officials,
Right.
and we can support organizations that are working to promote peace and disarmament.
I think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel powerless in the face of these massive global challenges.
Right.
But I think every voice, every action can make a difference.
Exactly. We can't underestimate the power of collective action.
Right.
If enough people demand a different future, one free from the threat of nuclear war, our leaders will eventually have to listen.
That's a great point. That's a message of hope, and I think we all need to hear that. We've explored some truly unsettling topics today, from the chilling reality of dead hand
Right.
to the risks associated with nuclear deterrence, the challenges of arms control. This is clearly a complex and challenging topic, but I think it's one that demands our attention, demands our engagement.
I couldn't agree more. We need to move beyond fear and despair and work towards a future where peace and security are not based on this threat of mutual destruction, but on cooperation, understanding, and a shared commitment to the well-being of all humanity.
So, we've been talking about some really heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Nuclear deterrence, the possibility of an accidental launch, the risks associated with these systems like dead hand. It's definitely a lot to process.
It is, and I think it's natural to feel a sense of unease, when you're contemplating these issues.
Right.
But as we were just discussing, it's crucial not to just succumb to this sense of powerlessness, right?
Right.
We can't simply resign ourselves to the idea that nuclear war is inevitable.
I agree. We need to be actively working towards a different future, one where these weapons are no longer a threat.
Right.
Earlier, we talked about the importance of diplomacy and arms control. What are some concrete steps that could be taken in those areas?
Well, as I mentioned before, renewing the New START treaty would be a significant step in the right direction.
Okay.
That treaty, which is set to expire in 2026, it places limits on the number of strategic nuclear warheads that both the U.S. and Russia can deploy.
Right.
Allowing it to lapse would be a major blow to global security.
So what would renewing that treaty actually entail? What would that look like in practice?
Essentially, it would involve both the U.S. and Russia agreeing to continue, abiding by the limits set out in the treaty.
Okay.
This means maintaining a certain number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads and allowing for inspections to verify compliance.
Oh.
And what about tactical nuclear weapons? We talked about how those are seen as more usable and therefore potentially more dangerous. Are there any efforts being made to limit or eliminate those?
Right. Yeah.
Unfortunately, progress on limiting tactical nuclear weapons has been much slower than on strategic weapons.
Okay.
Part of the challenge is that tactical nuclear weapons are more difficult to define and verify,
Okay.
which makes it harder to negotiate, treaties around them.
Right.
However, that doesn't mean we should give up.
So what can be done? Where do we even begin to address this?
Dialogue is always the first step, right?
Yeah.
We need to keep the lines of communication open between nuclear-armed states and continue to push for greater transparency and confidence-building measures.
Okay.
One idea that's been discussed is establishing a multilateral forum specifically focused on tactical nuclear weapons,
Okay.
where countries could come together to discuss concerns, share information, and explore potential avenues for arms control.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like a promising idea.
Oh.
But beyond, these formal diplomatic efforts, what role can individuals play in promoting peace and disarmament?
Individuals can play a critical role in shaping public opinion and pushing for change, right? We
Okay.
can start by educating ourselves about these issues, engaging in thoughtful discussions, and contacting our elected officials to express our concerns.
Right.
Supporting organizations that are working to promote peace and disarmament. That's another way to make a difference.
And I think it's also important to remember that even, small actions can have a ripple effect.
Absolutely.
Talking to friends and family about these issues,
Right.
sharing information on social media,
Yeah.
participating in peaceful protests. All of these things can help, raise awareness and
Excellent.
contribute to a broader movement for change.
I completely agree. Every voice matters.
Yeah.
We can't underestimate the power of collective action. If enough people demand a different future, one free from the threat of nuclear war, our leaders will eventually have to listen.
That's a message of hope that I think we all need to hear. We've explored some truly unsettling topics today,
We have.
from the chilling reality of dead hand to the risks associated with nuclear deterrence, the challenges of arms control. But I think it's important to end on a note of empowerment. We are not powerless in the face of these threats.
Right.
We can, and we must, work together to create a more peaceful and secure world for ourselves and for future generations.
Well said. It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you for diving into these complex issues with me.
It's been a pleasure.
Oh.
And thank you to our listener for sharing these sources with us and for prompting this deep dive into the world of Dead Hand. Remember, knowledge is power. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going.